the School of Public Affairs here at American University, and I want to thank you all for joining us here today. And I want to thank our esteemed panelists of experts for joining us, and we look forward to hearing what you have to say about this very important topic. First, a little bit about the School of Public Affairs and the Washington Institute for Public Affairs Research. The school is home to leading scholars in a range of public policy issues. Our faculty conduct research, contribute to policy dialogue, and engage in some of the most pressing policy issues of our time. And in that activity, their faculty research is ranked as tops in the world. We are #1 in DC and #5 internationally for the impact of the research that our faculty conduct. So we're working at a very high level of productivity with a very high level of esteem for the work we do. Our panelists here today represent some of that. Our policy areas include healthcare, environment, education, social welfare, and of course today's topic, policies related to crime, policing, and justice. The school's Washington Institute for Public Affairs Research serves as a bridge between the academic and the policy worlds. The Institute helps SPA scholars develop and advance research projects relevant to policy, politics, and of course social justice, especially encouraging collaborative work. And that is no small feat in an academic environment, so I applaud Dave for taking that on and being successful at it. No issue calls for more attention from the policy, politics, and collaborative arena than the topic we're going to discuss today. It's been nearly 50 years since President Lyndon Johnson's commission released a landmark report titled The Challenge of Crime in a Free Society. And it was, of course, about the state of crime, justice, and policing in America. Today, we've got the opportunity to hear from renowned experts and policymakers reflecting on both the progress made and the challenges ahead for the next president. We still see today many of the same issues and concerns of 50 years ago. Police-community relations, racial tensions, to name a few. But today's world is even more complex. Now we have cell phones, body cameras, and dash cams, which create new dynamics for accountability, some good, some bad. We have social media, which sparks viral spread of stories and accounts of injustice, as well as viral spread of intolerance and exclusionary ideas. We have data on racism, violence against women, and the like, and we have the increasing presence of and visibility of gun violence in our communities and in our classrooms. These issues are of critical importance for the future of any community, including Washington, D.C., and is well worth the time of our talented panel and our audience members. With that, I want to turn it over to our moderator, Dave Marcotte, who is professor in the School of Public Affairs and director of the Washington Institute for Public Affairs Research. Dave is a renowned expert and researcher in education policy. His work includes emphasis on understanding the connections between mental health, risky behavior, and crime. So my special thanks to Dave for his leadership in organizing this event. We are pleased to have you all here today, all of you as well as our panelists, and we look forward to hearing what our experts have to say. Thank you. Dave, over to you.
Thank you, Dean Drumzak. And thanks to the staff in the Dean's office and YPAR for putting this event on today. And I want to thank the Provost's office EWI initiative for helping make this possible. And welcome to everybody. I'm happy to have the honor today to kind of orient you to what we're going to talk about and introduce you to our panel of experts. We come here today to talk about crime, policing, and justice during tumultuous times around these topics, both for the country and for our politics. You don't need to be an expert to know that homicide rates in some cities are going up. You don't need to be an expert to know that police-involved shootings under circumstances that are perhaps criminal are in the news, or that attacks on police officers in retribution are occurring. These have all only fueled a smoldering fire of anxiety around the country about crime. And anxiety has roots in mass shootings from Sandy Hook to San Bernardino, from Aurora to Orlando, to a staggering and abrupt increase in markets and heroin addiction in small towns across the country, and to violence against women on college campuses and beyond. Clearly, the next administration has got a lot on their plate and daunting challenges to face. Our discussion today hopes to put these into perspective by taking a long view of crime and criminal justice, how we got here, and where we might be going. We've organized our discussion today around a reflection on the crime report to the President written 50 years ago. In 1965, President Johnson appointed commissioners and asked them to report on crime in America. In the spring or the fall of 1966, at this time of the year, they were finalizing the report to deliver it the 1st of 1967. We've asked our panelists to reflect on the issues that were important in the country at that time from that panel's report, to assess what progress has been made since that time, and to ponder what might be part of a new report to the upcoming president, should the incoming president have the wisdom to use evidence to think about policy. One of the lessons of the report that I want to highlight for those of you who had a chance to read it is that reading it cures you of a tendency we all have. We look at the past with rose-colored glasses. In a world like we're in, reeling from the issues I just described, it's all too common to think of the America of the past as simple and safe. But right from the start, the report dispels those misconceptions. I want to read you some excerpts from the very first paragraph of the report. There is much crime in America, more than ever is reported, far more than ever is solved, far too much for the health of the nation. Every American knows that. Some have been made afraid to use public streets and parks. Some have come to doubt the worth of a society in which so many people behave so badly. Some have become distrustful of government. Some have become suspicious of those they conceive to be responsible for crime, adolescents or Negroes or drug addicts or college students. The language here is dated, and some of the references maybe even seem a little bizarre to us, but the issues and the concerns are recognizable today. So I'm happy that we brought together a panel to discuss and sort through the layered and sometimes dubious perceptions and assessments we have about crime. Some of the news you'll hear is good, that we understand patterns and the extent of crime much better today than we did 50 years ago, that we take seriously crime that was ignored then, and that on many dimensions, we are far safer than we were then. But not all is good, and maybe this is part of the good story. I couldn't help but put this slide up. This is from the report featuring data on strong arm robberies and muggings occurring in Washington, D.C. in the first week, 2 days in December of 1966. And I put this up for two reasons. One, it focuses on what we sort of think about as inner city crime, muggings, armed robberies, the kinds of things that might have been part of your fear growing up about crime. The kinds of crime we see today are different, very different in many ways than this litany of what occurred in D.C. in 1966. And also this points out that the past wasn't as safe as sometimes we believe. But we'll also hear some news that is potentially concerning. We'll hear that there are new levels of substance abuse and incarceration that would have been unimaginable in 1966. And we'll hear that many of the concerns about policing and unfairness of policing in certain communities are as relevant today as they were back then. So we've organized the panel today to focus on 4 key issues that were in the report that are at the heart of the concern of America's concerns today about crime. Overall level of crime, policing and community relations, substance abuse, and then guns and violence. We'll begin the panel with remarks by our panelists on each of these topics in turn. Each panelist will talk about one of these issues for about 10 minutes or so, and afterward we'll have a moderated discussion for about 30 minutes, and then there'll be 30 minutes time for you to engage with the panel and ask the questions that you have in mind and hear about the things you want to hear. So let me turn to introductions of the panelists. I'll be brief here because many of you either know them in person or you know them by reputation, and also because today's program has short biographies of each of our panelists. The first speaker will be Professor Lynn Addington of the School of Public Affairs. Dr. Addington is an expert on violent crime, victimization, and measuring crime, including crimes against groups historically and recently overlooked, such as women and members of the LGBT community. Her research is widely published and has been funded by the National Institute of Justice, the Bureau of Justice Statistics, and the American Statistical Association, among others. She is the editor-in-chief of the journal Homicide Studies and regularly consults with agencies like the Census Bureau on how to measure crime. Her many accomplishments include receiving American University's Top Faculty Research Award just this year. And this is her second career. She worked as a law clerk for a federal district court judge and a civil litigator before becoming an academic. The second panelist to speak will be Deputy Chief Daryl D'Souza of the Baltimore City Police Department. Deputy Chief D'Souza has worked in the Baltimore City Police Department for more than 28 years and has worked in many different positions and many executive positions across the agency. He served as Deputy Commissioner, the Chief of Patrol, an Area Commander. Before that, as a detective, he worked in Violent Crimes Task Force, the Drug Enforcement Unit, and the Organized Crime Division, and implemented the agency's first cyber crimes unit. His honors outside of the department are many. He serves as a trustee or a board member on a variety of organizations, and he's now a fellow at the International Association of Chiefs of Police, having just returned from San Diego on some real hard duty. The third panelist is Dr. Jonathan Calkins, who is the H. Guyford Stever University Professor at the Heinz College of Public Policy at Carnegie Mellon. Professor Calkins is among the world's foremost authorities on drug policy and crime and terror. He's authored more than 125 journal articles and 10 books on topics including marijuana legalization and illicit drugs and drug policy. His research has been funded by the National Science Foundation, the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, the National Institute of Justice, and the Department of Defense, and he started Rand's office in Pittsburgh. His many honors include receiving the David Kershaw Award by APAM, which is the main scholarly association in public policy, for extraordinary contributions to research on public policy and management before the age of 40. And I know, looking at Dr. Calkins, you, like me, wonder what he's going to do after he turns 40. And the last panelist is Dr. Phil Cook, who's the ITT Terry Stanford Professor of Public Policy at Duke University, where he's also a professor in economics and sociology. Phil's accomplishments are so varied and substantial, I cannot describe them all. But one of the areas he works in, among many, are in firearms and crime, gun control, and crime and criminal justice. He has many publications, including his most recent book from Oxford University Press, The Gun Debate, and an upcoming volume from Russell Sage on a multi-city study of underground gun markets, pardon me. His work has been funded by the National Institutes of Health, the National Institutes of Justice, the Guggenheim and Joyce Foundation, and the U.S. Department of Education. On his substantial list of honors, Professor Cook is a member of the Institute of Medicine at the National Academy of Sciences and a fellow at the American Society for Criminology and the Academy of Experimental Criminology. He also won APAM's Vernon Prize for the best paper twice. I think he may be the only person to have done that. So we have a truly distinguished panel. We'll hear from them in turn, starting with Professor Lynn Addington.
Sorry. Stumbling. Got those accomplishments, but I can't walk. Okay, great. Thanks so much, Dave, both for that kind introduction, although I feel I'm the low bar here, and also for putting the panel together. I want to thank everyone for coming today on this beautiful day. I know half of our undergrads are flopped out on the quad here. So I want a few caveats before I start my discussion or my talk here, and that's that I could spend all day talking about crime data and the President's Commission. So a lot of issues came out of the report, and we don't have a lot of time. So I'm just going to make a few points, and if we want to have discussion later on, I'm happy to talk to you more about some of the additional points or go into more detail. And I'm just focusing on crime data, which might be a little strange because the President's Commission focused a lot on the criminal justice system and in fact created the idea of a criminal justice system. But I wanted to focus on the crime data, one, because it's the input to the criminal justice system, and also because if we think about what the Commission report did or said, basically the Commission made over 200 recommendations, but the Commission itself basically said the overall theme was they were calling for a revolution in the way America thinks about crime. Of course, revolution, it's, okay, it was the 60s, there we go. But also what we think about, but the idea that they really wanted to change how Americans thought about crime, and how do you change thinking? One, you have to know what people are thinking. And so you need information and data to do that. And then also, if you're going to change their thinking, then you also need information to how do we change the previous thoughts into where we want people to go. And so to understand kind of why this is important and the implications, it's important to understand the context and basically what did people know at the time of the Crime Commission. And basically what this kind of context, both the public and also the Commission, it's a lot of things that we kind of take for granted today that we just think of as common knowledge. And one is that, but at that time, the data that we had was just police data. And it was basically the UCR, the Uniform Crime Reporting data, those official data, the aggregate counts. So we didn't have incident details. We basically were focused on street crimes, so the strong arm robberies and the homicides, important, but those were basically, those 8 crimes were what we were pretty much limited to. And we basically had lagged information. So essentially 8 to 10 months, 9 to 10 months after the end of the year is when we would get crime data. So that's what people knew. They were thinking basically the last year of crime data on only these particular crimes. And then also there was no Bureau of Justice Statistics or federal agency that collected crime data. Imagine that. So we didn't have a lot of information there, and nobody was doing a lot of crime research. Those of you who are getting a degree in criminal justice, there wasn't a criminal justice academic program. Crime was studied via maybe political science or sociology, but it wasn't its own discipline, so there wasn't a lot of research. So basically what the Commission had to do is they had to undertake all of the data collection to get at what people knew, what was going on, and that sort of thing. So there was not a lot going on. They did a lot of victimization studies, kind of pioneered that area, and also police observation studies, those kinds of things. So basically that information that the Commission collected led to the recommendations, the main recommendations that they made about crime data. And these basically map onto what the Commission confronted in the limitations of their data. So they wanted a new yardstick, a new measure of crime at the national level. They wanted something that would supplement or basically be a check on the police data, the UCR data. One of the things that they found is that with the victimization studies is that there was this dark figure of crime. There was a lot of unreported crime that was going on. And they wanted more incident details, so they wanted this new data collection being done. They also wanted a creation of a statistical organization that would collect crime and criminal justice data. They were interested in promoting research, and also they wanted regular, timely indicators, kind of like the Bureau of Labor Statistics does on unemployment, jobs creation, consumer price index. That's what they wanted for crime. And so what the legacy, and I put immediate in quotes because we are talking about the federal government, so immediate is only, it's not like tomorrow. No offense to anyone in the federal government here. But there's a little, but these are the things that immediately came out of the report. And the main legacy of the Crime Commission is the creation of what was then the National Crime Survey. Now it's called the National Crime Victimization Survey. Before that, we did not realize that we could ask people about their experiences with crime, and they would tell us, and we could use that as a national indicator. So this is really huge. And it was several surveys at the time, but basically the legacy of it is the household individual talking about their experience with crime. You get the dark figure of crime, you get incident characteristics reported to police and that sort of thing. We also bolstered the UCR with funding, and then created the predecessor of BJS, promoted scholarly research, and the regular timely crime indicator. Well, I put TBD, to be determined, as kind of the optimistic way of looking at this, since we're still waiting, or the pessimistic is that it's MIA. We don't have this right now. It was not something that was, I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. with regard to kind of longer-term legacies of the Crime Commission, basically the data that we got from the NCVS and this bolstered UCR was a foundation for innovation. And that's what we got, information that allowed us to expand it, allowed us to improve what we knew about crime, and what we'd like to get about information we'd like to get about crime. So we were able to improve the UCR. Now we have the National Incident-Based Reporting System that gives us incident-based information from the police. And with the National Crime Survey, it became the National Crime Victimization Survey that gave us better measures of certain types of crime, better specific details, as well as supplements about particular types of crime. The other thing we got was a framework for studying crimes not in the report. And I want to focus, one, on the violence against women. This was not discussed pretty much at all in the Crime Commission's report, which might sound shocking to us now because that's kind of what we hear a lot about. It's a big concern. Rape, sexual assault, especially issues on college campuses, that's a big discussion point for us. So the fact that this was not even talked about in the Crime Commission report seems kind of strange to us. But really, those topics weren't addressed until the 70s with the women's movement, victim advocacy, victim rights movements. That's when we got a lot of information, or a lot of desire for attention on those types of crimes. And so that was an area where we realized, based on what we knew, the patterns and the foundation from the crime report, we realized, well, we could get that information from victimization surveys. And in fact, from the NCVS, realized there was a lot of underreporting, so those victimization surveys are really important to utilize to understand violence against women, whether it's intimate partner violence, stalking, or also rape, sexual assault. We've done a lot of work based on building off of those crime victimization surveys to better understand how we can ask questions, of different populations, college students, behavior-specific questions, and that sort of thing, as well as just emerging issues, other issues that are of relevance to the public who've changed over the past 50 years. We're interested in issues like hate crime. We're interested in issues like school violence, bullying, human trafficking. These are all topics that we're interested in, and we'd like to better understand. And the foundational information from what we learned from the crime report, the victimization surveys, and the police data allowed us a foundation to look at that. And then also a legacy of the Crime Commission's report is the fact that the relevance of crime data beyond just the Bureau of Justice Statistics and the Department of Justice. So we're seeing crime as a health issue. It's a public health issue. Violence is a public health issue. So we see the Centers for Disease Control interested in studying these issues, whether it's with the National Intimate Partner and Sexual Violence Survey, whether it's with YRBS, which is looking at youth violence issues, those kinds of things, as well as education. The Education Department collects a lot of information about school violence, bullying, responses to school violence. And so Dave asked for us to kind of project out. And so I said, current issues, I said, revolution, which is kind of the 60s term, or data 2.0, which might be the more current way of looking at this. So I thought a few things to look at. And again, some of this work is currently being done, so it's not that I'm a genius here, but kind of just looking at the field and looking at what where interest is. And it's basically looking at how the data are collected. We're certainly continuing to revisit the police data, the victimization data, and to see how those could be improved. A lot of support's being given, in fact, to the UCR, the NIBR system right now. But larger questions about the capabilities of an omnibus crime survey. Is that the best way to collect the data that we want? Are there ways to leverage across sources? And of course, then also the associated privacy issues that come with that if you kind of start combining data sources together. And also the way new technologies can be used. If we, with our cell phones, with our kind of Google searches, with all sorts of things, how can we leverage that data? Would that be useful to understand crime better? Also reconsidering what data are collected, what crimes do we want to look at? And when we start thinking about these things, so right now there's a National Academy of Sciences Modernizing Crime Statistics panel that's looking at these issues, about looking at how do we go beyond official names of crimes and look at attributes of those crimes that would better let us look at crime locally as well as make comparisons internationally. Looking at beyond the street crime paradigm, emerging crime issues. We're interested in, we typically look at street crime specific beginning and end. What about these crimes of continuous duration, we call them, stalking, bullying, intimate partner violence, and gain a better handle on those. Looking at risk across victim characteristics, so looking at LGBT characteristics, for example, immigration status, elder abuse, kind of gain a better handle on some of those crimes that are of interest to people right now, and connecting these with policy. And then finally, the idea, going back to that original call for national statistical indicators, and which would require something that's current. As I said, our most current, in fact, today I just got an email saying, hey, guess what? The 2015 NCBS data just came out today. I'm like, what the fuck? I mean, it's like, it's 2016 right now, the end of October. When did we get the jobs report for September? 7 to 10 days after the month ended. I mean, what good does, I mean, for me as a researcher, yeah, sure, I love having data. I don't care how old it is, it's always good. But if we're really trying to make policy, waiting for a year for the data, that's a little silly in some ways. So how can we get timely data? And also when I say I had to use basket in quotes because I realized basket has a lot of connotations anymore. But with the basket of contents, the idea is, what's the basket of crime? You know, if we talk about the UCR crime, we're looking at crimes that were identified in 1930. Do you think the Consumer Price Index used the items that people bought in 1930 to determine inflation now? No, they changed them around. So it could be that we would still use the same kinds of crimes, but we might want to revisit how we define those. Is violence still defined the same way that we defined it in the 1930s? So those would be things to kind of consider, again, to inform policy and to have faster measures of crime. But, you know, as I said, I could spend all time, I could keep going here. But I know we've got other panelists, so I'll turn it back over to Dave.
So our next speaker will be Daryl D'Souza from the Baltimore City.
All right, good afternoon, everybody. You guys awake? I just got back from San Diego yesterday. Is anyone from the West Coast here? West Coast? And I got a little bit of a jet lag. So I got back yesterday, and I'm still feeling kind of sluggish a little bit. The reason why I was in San Diego was because it was the International Association for Chiefs of Police, the IACP. It was our national conference. So it was 3 or 4 days. I was there for 6 days because I'm doing my fellowship there. And I'll talk a little bit about the IACP shortly, but I want to say that for those from the West Coast, it's a different culture for me. They put me up in a Hard Rock hotel, and when I left my hotel like 6 in the morning, the music was blasting in the lobby like it was a nightclub or something. And then I was at conference all day until 9 p.m., and I'm like, well, let me hurry up and get back to my room and go to sleep. But at 9 o'clock at night, guess what? The music was the same as it was at 6 o'clock. So I'm still suffering just a little bit, but thanks for having me. I appreciate it. This is a wonderful campus. I got lost when I got here, and thanks for the great advertising that I realized that the event was here. So thanks again. But I wear 3 hats that I'm very proud of, and I'm sure folks in this room wear several hats. But the first hat that I wear is 28 years with the Baltimore City Police Department. It seems like I spent a lifetime there. And when folks introduce me, or when I talk about me having 28 years on the job, people look at me and like, wait a minute, it's no way possible. My son turned 27 3 weeks ago, and my daughter turns 19 2 weeks from tomorrow. And they look at me and say, how is that possible? Like, what are you drinking? And I tease them, and I always say that I have the Benjamin Button disease. But I wear 3 hats, and I'm real proud of the work that the men and women of the police department have done in the Baltimore City Police Department. And I'm sure I'm probably going to get 1,000 questions later about the Freddie Gray incident, where we were then and where we are now. The other hat that I wear is doing the IACP fellowship. So I started August of this year, and the fellowship is 1 year. So August of next year, I complete that. And when I got to IACP, they put me on a project right away, and I'm real proud of this project, or 2 projects they put me on right away when I did my fellowship. And I can talk about it a little bit after or in this presentation. The first project I got put on is the National Use of Force Policy. So by show of hands here, who would agree that the way use of force looks in America now, it's kind of unbalanced by a show of hands. So, yeah, so we have been working, and there's 4 of us, 2 researchers, a policy expert, and myself, been working on this policy for quite some time now. We're kind of proud of it. It's not long, it's 2 or 3 pages. We want something that the officers can digest right away, but the discussion paper is almost 3 times it. The discussion paper is probably about 6 or 7 pages. So we rolled that project out this past Monday at IACP conference. It went well. We still have a lot of work to do. There was 3 issues that pretty much caused hiccups for us. It caused hiccups for law enforcement years ago in the 60s, and it's still creating hiccups now. Does anyone want to guess what some of those hiccups are? So number 1 hiccup is, and just pretend you're a police officer, just bear with me. If you are a police officer and you're working right now, do you think that it's appropriate to fire a warning shot? By a show of hands, who says yes? A warning shot. Who says no? So I needed you guys with me on Monday. The other big issue that we're having right now, and a big issue we had with this policy, is firing from a moving vehicle or at a moving vehicle. So you're the same police officer and you're sitting in your patrol car and your vehicle is moving. Do you think it's appropriate for you to fire if you have probable cause and if the agency is there and it's a matter of life or death? Do you think that it's appropriate for you to fire your weapon from a moving vehicle? I got 1 yes. Any more yeses? Who says no? Okay, so this is how it was this past Monday. The other part of that is firing at, and this is an issue that was around in the 60s, the 70s, and the 80s, particularly in the 70s in New York City. Who agrees that firing at, so you're outside your vehicle, firing at a moving vehicle is appropriate? So the other half would say it's not appropriate to fire at a moving vehicle. Who is familiar with the Nice, France incident that happened about a month and a half ago? You guys familiar with the Nice, France incident? Big box truck, big refrigerated truck, going down the street, driver refused to stop. You 2 are police officers. You guys are police officers. This whole side of the room is deployed in Nice, France. You guys are on foot. You're there. And you guys see this vehicle barreling down. Is it appropriate for you to fire your weapon at a moving vehicle, at that box truck? Do you guys agree, yes or no? Show of hands, yes. Show of hands, no. So what happens when that vehicle goes out of control? It was out of control already, but what happens when the vehicle goes out of control even more? Or if there are anyone that's, and I'm not a physics major or a physicist, but will a .40 caliber bullet stop a 4 or 5 ton truck vehicle? It won't. It won't. So those were the major issues that we're working on now with the National Use of Force Policy, and again, I'll touch upon it a little bit later. I think it was great. The last thing, project-wise, that I was on, I'm certainly going to talk about it, is in one of my slides, is mental illness and how police respond to mental illness. There was an incident that happened in New York, I think it was 2 or 3 nights ago, mental illness. So the IACP rolled out something called the One Mind campaign. I'm going to get to that in just a second. But in San Diego, it was a great convention, and those were some of the things that I worked on. And those are the things that law enforcement are progressively looking at, because in the 60s and the 70s, do you think law enforcement looked at some of these issues and thought it was a concern? Do you think law enforcement looked at issues of mental illness? Do you think law enforcement looked at issues of firing warning shots? Obviously, law enforcement did, but is it appropriate now? I'm a little bit old, and you have to show me which button to click to go to the next one. Okay. So these are some of the issues that I wanted to highlight, the positive highlights of 1967 report. And the first one is technology. And technology has come a long way since then. I think looking back then, who would know what policing would look like if you didn't write, and Dr. Addington mentioned it. Suppose, how do you collate crime? How do you know your part 1 crimes versus your part 2 crimes? how do you, as a district commander or a chief of police, how do you deploy your officers on the streets if you don't have a feel of a crime around you? So what's interesting is I looked at some of the great technologies over the past couple of years, since 67, and Dr. Additing, I think you mentioned one or two of them, but 1967, the National Crime Information Center was established. Who knows what that is? So that's the ability for any police officer to go on the streets right now and walking foot in a patrol car, you get a call for service, and you encounter somebody, and you want to find out if that person is wanted here or perhaps in another country. So we have the capabilities now, thanks to the commission back in '67, that said, hey, let's put a mechanism in place that if you call and you say, my name is, you stop Dave Marcotte, and you have him and you give his date of birth, guess what? A positive hit comes back on him. So I hope not. So that was one of the main ones. Another one that I want to highlight also in 1968 was the 9/11 call for service. So how did police respond from call to call to call prior to that? So actually, the IACP had a lot to do with the 9/11 system, and they introduced legislation to say, hey, listen, there's got to be a way that you guys have to be able to inform the police where and when to go. So the 9/11 system came about 1970s. CAD, who knows what CAD is? Computer aided dispatch, that came about. You have police background? Good. Okay, good. And we're recruiting, by the way, also. 1980s enhanced 911. So all that was that now dispatchers were able to see a terminal. They were able to see where the units were. They were able to see the calls physically on the board versus a card that a dispatcher was handed from the 911 dispatcher. 1993, and I remember this very well. So for a population of 50,000 or more, so Baltimore has 623,000 now. Back in the 90s, the numbers was a little bit higher, but they established the computers in police stations. And I recall, and I know I'm pressed for time, it's probably down to 3 minutes now, that it was very difficult to write search warrants. It was very difficult to write an admin report. You had to actually handwrite it. So that was one of the biggest things that, technology-wise, that really helped the police department. And if I jump to today, what's the biggest thing? Body-worn cameras. Body-worn cameras. So the commission also said that police departments, and I took this, when I read this, I was like, wow, this is a tough one to swallow here, that police officers were undertrained, undereducated, underpaid, undersupervised, and ill-equipped. And the report said that because of that, police officers had flexibility to do great good or to do great harm. So what do you think happened throughout the course of years, 50 years from now? Was it more great, or was there more harm? And that's, I guess we can debate that and have that as a panel discussion. I'll just jump ahead real quick. So what does it look like now? These are the top areas that, and again, I'll save it for the panel. Mental illness and homelessness is really plaguing America today. The Washington Post did an article last year, and of 980 police-involved shootings in 2015, the report says that a quarter of that, a report says 247 or so persons that were shot by police displayed some type of mental illness. So when we go back and say the police were undertrained and undereducated, and in my 28 years of experience, I could embarrassingly say that I can count the number of hours, probably on both hands, that I got specialized training on what mental illness looks like. So we went to calls for service, and we didn't know. The dispatcher gave us a call for service, dispatched us, told us to go to a certain location. We go to the certain location thinking it could be like a burglary call, not educated wisely. We respond to the location, and it's a mom having an issue with a son who's suffering from bipolar or schizophrenia. And we see it now. What's happening now in today? You see a young man jumping out of a bathroom or coming out with an object that's not a weapon and confronts the police officer. So is it appropriate enough to use your weapon? Is it appropriate enough to fire? So what tools do we have? How do we de-escalate? Another topic that I can talk for hours on is the community-oriented policing. That's the way of the future. That's the way. I have to cut it short. I'm so sorry, Dave. I can talk forever, but please, I'd love to hear your responses. I'd love to hear your questions as it relates specifically to mental illness and any type of use of force. So thank you very much. I'm sorry about that.
Thanks, Darryl. Lots of great things to take up in the discussion. Our next presenter is going to be Professor John Calkins from Carnegie Mellon. First slide.
Yep.
All right, thanks.
Thanks for the introduction. Thanks for the chance to be here. I'm honored and thrilled to have the chance, and it was great to read this chapter of this prestigious document. I confess I hadn't actually read it before. The overall impression I had was they thought drugs was a pretty backwater minor issue back in 1966. It's like, well, if we're going to have a full comprehensive report, I guess we need a chapter, but there's not much happening. They did not know that a tsunami was about to hit the country, and I'll come back to that in just a minute. So what did they write? Well, they wrote about half just information about the drugs, half recommendations. Their framework for talking about the drugs is the old-fashioned narcotics and dangerous drugs, where narcotics meant heroin, cocaine, and marijuana. They even noted that this is really not pharmacologically accurate, but that's how things were classified. And absolutely, it was all about the opiates, specifically heroin. That was what mattered to them, and they felt really good about it, because the basic situation was that from 1914, when the Harrison Anti-Narcotics Act was passed, until 1947, there wasn't much going on. We had 2 world wars in a period of isolationism, not much coming across the border of any kind, including not much in the way of heroin. Right after World War II, there was an epidemic, law enforcement got scared, cracked down, and it worked. In 1966, heroin was only available in a very select number of places in the country. It was so scarce, the potency was extraordinarily low. So they felt really good about that. Cocaine, 1 stinking little tiny paragraph. They said, look, back at the turn of the 20th century, this was a problem. We don't see anything now. Their discussion of marijuana was actually quite progressive, pointing out things like the oddity of the law lumping it together with heroin. Dangerous drugs completely befuddled and overwhelmed them. This is all of the psychedelics and the stimulants and so on. And at that point, the laws were completely inconsistent around the country. Many states didn't even have laws. The commission really was sort of overwhelmed and confused about that situation. The recommendations were naturally more research, specifically on cannabis. And I think the story here is that many on the commission probably were ready to do some bold statement about, say, decriminalization, but they couldn't quite get there. So it's always safe to recommend more research. And they definitely wanted more research on the dangerous drugs. There were recommendations for more enforcement, not surprisingly, but not a lot in terms of expensive big-ticket items. They suggested that the states adopt the federal statute as a model statute, particularly on the dangerous drugs. They wanted an increase in customs staff. This is actually pretty reasonable, because customs was staffed for our period of isolationism. And in the 1960s, there was far more international commerce, a lot more people coming across the borders with the inventions of jet planes and so on. So that's pretty reasonable. They wanted more agents in the Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs. Again, this is pretty reasonable because it was a very, very small agency at the time. So expanding that's not a big ticket item. And they had a bunch of fairly dovish arguments. A big chunk of it was railing against mandatory minimum sentences and their inflexibility and their harshness. That language is essentially identical to what you've heard in the last 10 or 20 years. They talked a lot about treatment positively, including this newfangled technology called methadone maintenance, but made no recommendation about it at all. And I think what's going on there is that in 1966, there was no notion that the federal government could have any role in drug treatment. That didn't happen until President Nixon, sort of wrongly maligned as having started the drug war, which isn't true. Nixon was the one who launched the federal role in drug treatment using methadone maintenance. But at the time, they had nothing to say because the federal government didn't do anything in that area. Let me get that historical context in. we have no data systems on drugs that go back to the 1960s other than UCR arrests. And there are a bunch of reasons why you can't just look at the UCR numbers over time because they're non-comparable. But 6 months ago, I had this epiphany that it'd be really interesting to plot the ratio of drug arrests to, on this slide, it's robbery arrests, but you can also do this with burglary. And the reason that I'm interested in this is that burglary and robbery are sort of the bread and butter of what police do. It's what fills a lot of their workload. And so the ratio of drug arrests to these property crime arrests give you a sense of whether or not drug enforcement was a big deal issue or not a big deal issue for law enforcement. So what you can see in this slide is up until the time the commission's report came out, drug enforcement was a very minor matter. There were 3 or 4 times as many robbery arrests as there were drug arrests, and there were even more burglary arrests than robbery arrests. And that changed dramatically around the time of the report. In fact, I want to zoom in this slide, so now just through 1970, so you can see what a precipice there was. The dot for 1966, which was when the work of the commission was done, is the last dot before the deluge, before the tsunami came and drugs exploded on the country and became a very big issue. So I'm supposed to look forward now, and I teach forecasting, and one of the things I teach my students is don't forecast because you're usually wrong, and a lot of times you are embarrassingly wrong. And I've just told you how completely blindsided those very smart people were back then, so I do the next couple minutes with enormous trepidation. But my punchline here is I think that the current posture is not sustainable, that favorite word of 2016. I don't think we're going to get hit with a tsunami. I don't think the change is going to happen as fast as it did in 1967. But I think for a variety of reasons, there are trends that you can identify today that seem like relatively safe bets to continue into the future that really undermine the basic posture of our policy. Things like globalization and open borders really undercut the ability of drug enforcement to reproduce that tightening of supply that it succeeded in doing against heroin in the post-World War II period. There's also a phenomenon called multiple market equilibria. I'd love to go into in detail, but the basic story is if there's not much drugs in a country, you can stay there. Once the horse is out of the barn or Pandora's box is opened or whatever metaphor you want to use, it's really hard to put the toothpaste back in the bottle. Got 3 metaphors in one sentence. And then there are also phenomena overseas. Where am I on time? Cool. In final market countries like the United States, we tend to make a difference between the quote-unquote soft drugs like cannabis, maybe we'll legalize that, but no, not crack. In Latin America, if you get shot by a drug trafficker, you're just as dead whether that person was trafficking marijuana or cocaine. Now that the United States has opened up the door to explicitly violating the international conventions on this, I think there may be moves in Latin America to legalize not just cannabis, and that will really change the capacity of any country to maintain a regime like what we have. So I suspect that maybe not in the next 4 years of this administration, but looking farther past that, we are not going to sustain the basic framework we have, and I don't think that's all good. On a progressive campus like this, I suspect many of you are acutely aware of the problems of prohibition, but I'm not sure that the way that we may get rid of prohibition isn't going to be out of the frying pan into the fire. Because the fundamental premise of prohibition is paternalistic. It says that some fraction of people will mess up their lives when tempted by these dependence-inducing intoxicants. And I think that's right. We are fallible human beings and we sometimes make mistakes. And so when we take away prohibition, if we don't substitute some form of paternalism, we may find out that significantly larger numbers of people really suffer as a result of the opportunities that are not just made available to them, but are actively promoted by the corporations that we are having step into the cannabis market and may go elsewhere. Let me close really quickly with one little note. I've done a lot of work on marijuana legalization. After the 2010 California law almost passed, my colleague and I made a presentation in the Netherlands, 2 academics who all were pro-legalization. We described the California law and how it would have allowed for-profit corporations to produce, sell, and market cannabis. And these very liberal academics in the Netherlands said, "You're not serious. Nobody is stupid enough to do that." That's what we're doing for cannabis. Our current regime is not sustainable. I am not convinced that the thing that we're jumping to is going to be a bowl of peaches either. Thank you.
Our last presenter is Professor Philip Cook from Duke University.
Thanks, Dave, and hello, everyone. I was asked, of course, to talk about guns, something I've been working on since almost as long as this commission report has been out, but not quite. But as it turns out, it plays a relatively minor role in the report itself. There is a chapter on guns, and that goes on for 5 pages. And has a couple of recommendations at the end of it, which I can talk about briefly. But just as John said, that the report was being written at the edge of the tsunami of drugs and drug abuse in this country, it is also true that it was written at the edge of the tsunami of violence and of crime generally, which began going upwards in 1963 and then reached a high plateau in 1975 and stayed there until the early 90s. So the problem of violence, the problem of gun violence then was not looming as large at the time of this, except that, of course, we had just lost a president, President Kennedy in 1963 to gun violence, and we had a couple of riots by that time, the 1960s riots. It was actually in 1967 that we had the biggest, the Detroit riot. And the response to that had been a surge in handgun sales and a beginning of a profound change in the gun market along the way. So things were beginning to happen, but so far had not been reflected in a national debate or a debate about federal legislation. Most of the action had been at the state and local level, and that's where it stood. As a matter of fact, there was legislation in front of Congress when the commission was working that became our foundation legislation at the federal level in 1968, the Gun Control Act, but for some reason the commission doesn't mention it during this whole time. Okay, what was going on otherwise in the gun debate in 1967? Even back then, it was pretty heated. And in the discussion, they mentioned that the NRA was still, it was active already and had been for a long time. The commission cites broad support for moderate regulation. That seems to have been a constant. That goes back to then and continues. 2/3 of the American public favor moderate controls. They talked briefly about the Second Amendment and said it poses absolutely no problem for us doing what we want to. And it provided recommendations. The recommendations were to limit mail order sales of handguns, which at that time were legal, interestingly enough. And then a much more radical proposal, which was to have universal registration of handguns by mandating that the states institute a registration program. And of course, the first one of those was adopted, the second one was not by a long shot. Okay. So we did have the Gun Control Act of 1968. A lot of the focus on that was to protect the states from each other by setting up a system of licensed dealers and barring people from buying out of state. So the idea was states could agree to disagree in this area. You could have Massachusetts right next door to Vermont, and Vermont is completely unregulated on guns. Massachusetts is very tightly regulated. And if the law is working right and the federal regulation works, then it helps. There are sales records kept by the dealers that help in police investigations, but there is nothing like centralized registration, except in a handful of states. In 1994, we had the Brady Act, which took the next step and actually imposed background checks for sales by dealers, and so that stopped the lie and buy business there. And so there was then, starting with the President's Commission, a series of actions by Congress and by the federal government that actually put the federal government into this business in a much more central way. Interestingly, at the same time, the NRA made it as a top priority to roll back state and local regulations with great success. And so, for example, when I moved to North Carolina, in order to buy a handgun, you had to go to the sheriff, prove that you had good moral character. That was the term they used, which meant you knew a couple of deputy sheriffs who would vouch for you. And it was illegal to carry concealed, period. There was no way to carry a concealed gun. And of course, all of that is now blown away. I mean, it's much easier to get handguns and to get a concealed carry permit. And that's just true in many states. The other thing that has been happening since then is that gun sports, which were really the main animus for gun sales and gun possession following World War II, were gradually being replaced by self-defense and as being the primary motivation. And what went with that was the decline of hunting and other gun sports, and the transformation in what kinds of guns we're selling from rifles and shotguns over to handguns, handguns being the self-defense weapon of choice. So increasingly, those handguns are very effective and high-powered and have large magazines. Another thing that has happened, I can only go back to 1980, but from survey data, is this very long decline in the percentage of households that have guns. And so not only are we seeing an abandonment of gun sports, but we also are seeing the abandonment of guns. So that increasingly what we are seeing is concentration. That it's not that there are fewer guns in circulation, but they're increasingly in the hands of a relatively few people. It's about 22% of all adults in this country now own a gun, but they average 5 or 6 guns, and many of them own 50. So that's the situation that we're faced with right now, and if you ask them why they're getting the gun, it's not to go hunting. The other trend worth noting is, of course, the NRA has become the most powerful, by some measures, lobby in the federal government, and it's become more extreme during that time. And the Republicans have pretty much 100% embraced the NRA agenda. That's a recent phenomenon. That's part of this general political polarization that's going on. Ronald Reagan, the revered Republican icon, in fact, supported gun control and fostered it in California when he was governor, and he supported the Brady Act after he left office, and somehow that gets lost in the conversation. Meanwhile, of course, we've had the Supreme Court reversed a couple of 100 years of rulings and litigation, and discover that the Second Amendment does, after all, provide a personal right to keep and bear arms, that it's not just a matter of protecting the state's militias from the federal interference, so that has made some difference and has resulted in an explosion of litigation attacking every kind of gun regulation that we have right now. So far without much success, but that's where we are. Okay, well, what are the pressing issues now? I would say that in the headlines, the most prominent feature of the 1960s were the assassinations. It was Jack Kennedy, later Robert Kennedy, and of course Malcolm X and Martin Luther King were all assassinated. Those were the big attention-grabbing, important stories about guns at the time. just as now the mass shootings are, the Sandy Hook shooting, the Orlando shooting, that kind of thing. Those are, we have not had high, highly visible assassinations in recent years, thank God, but we certainly have had a lot of violence. The second thing is, and Dave mentioned this, is that we have lived in a period where there's been a very long decline in gun violence that has been in lockstep with the decline overall of violence. It started in the early 1990s. And so in effect, the issue of gun violence to a large extent has diminished with the fact that the gun homicide rate, for example, today is half what it was in 1993. So the city after city has experienced this urban renewal thanks to becoming much safer than it was before. And a lot of that is indicated and captured in the result of a reduction in gun violence. And very worrisomely, last year there appeared to be a turnaround for the first time in all those years. So there was a 10% increase in murder, and the gun rate went up accordingly. So we may be in for another epidemic. Who knows? It's too early to say. But if it does, it's going to transform the conversation about guns, because it'll stop being the symbolic issue about personal rights and start being an issue about survival again. And finally, I would say that we have this kind of remarkable, in my mind, important phenomenon of gun violence is the leading cause of gun homicide, is leading cause of death for youthful African-American males, for example, and in all kinds of ways is a huge public health issue as well as a crime problem. And yet there was no research at all done on this prior to the time of the President's Commission report. Zero systematic studies by anybody, public health, social science, law. It just didn't exist. Since then, things have picked up a bit, no thanks to the funding picture. But it clearly is a high priority issue and one that deserves much more attention. So thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Phil. And thanks to all the panelists. I want to pick up, to initiate a discussion among the panelists on a topic that several of you touched on, but only indirectly. So in 10 minutes to talk about everything we know about the topics that the panelists have been asked to do is, of course, very difficult. So they've given us a good feeling for how things have changed in the aggregate, with some hints about how things might have changed the distribution of drug use or gun violence or crime in general or policing might have changed. So I'd like to ask the panelists to consider how social privilege and race and class have interacted with the experience of crime, with gun violence, with drug use, et cetera, over this period, and perhaps embed your answer with another theme taken up by the panel. That we've learned more and understood a lot more about crime over time because we have so much better data. Is there any sense that things have gotten any better? That being a poor person in America is safer, or you're less likely to be harassed by the police or become addicted to drugs, or being African American in the United States? What's life experience like in 1967, 68 compared to today? So I'd like to have a discussion around social equity issues on these topics. And I'm happy to have anyone start.
Yeah, I'll start. So I think the theme, and not just a theme, but I think there's direct fact that it's, and by way of numbers, that in the African American community, it's a challenge for these young men and women that between the ages of 17 and 24, that researchers say that they're 98% stand a chance of being a victim of a gun violence, or 97% chance of being a suspect in one of those gun-type crimes. But it's real challenging in the communities because you do see two things. You see an increase in drug transactions versus years past in the 60s. So now you're seeing in a lot of major cities, you see the sales of the opioids. And back in the 60s, it was specifically heroin. Now we're seeing with the young men and young women, we're seeing prescription pills, opioids, prescription pills. So back in the 60s, we noticed that the typical age was probably around 18 to 24. And I can speak directly in Baltimore, where now we're seeing opioid abuse, specifically prescription pill abuse and sales, starting at an early age, around 13 and 14. So if you drive down some of the tough streets in Baltimore, it's really sad to see 12, 13, 14-year-old kids that are either selling it or hooked on it. So it's real challenging. The other piece to that is the infiltration of gang violence, that these kids, because of broken homes, lack of education, that they're turning to gangs to support themselves. And I'm not saying that every single person in a gang is a bad person, but they're turning to gangs. And we all know that a good portion of these gangs started on the West Coast. So throughout the 80s and into the 90s, and now we're seeing those same gangs that were prevalent, the Bloods and the Crips, and now BGF, which is the Black Guerrilla Family, here in a lot of big East Coast cities. So between those two, I think that the hope that a lot of African American kids see is they're trying to get their way out of the system, but they're stuck. They're stuck in that violent cycle.
Well, I want to let other panelists comment, but I want to ask you a question, Daryl, too, that's related to a comment you made about reflecting on the report's observation that police were undertrained, undereducated, underfunded. Well, that may have changed, hopefully it's changed, but I expect that there is a real maldistribution in resources and in training across space. Are poor families more likely to be policed by the least trained police officers, or are they in areas where resources are scarce for policing and encounter more risk as a consequence?
You want me to do that one?
Yeah, and then we'll pass it on.
Yeah, no, I think that we've come a long way from training. I think that we're addressing issues, especially the two that I mentioned earlier was the mental illness, and the other part was de-escalation. But in any major city, you come out the academy, you graduate, you're deployed into patrol, and there is really no specific overload in a particular area. However, in Baltimore itself, there's 9 districts. So wherever there's a need of manpower, that's where the young officers go. So you're distributed within 9 districts, and every district is a challenge. You know, every district is a challenge. So there is no particular being assigned to a rough area versus a non-rough area.
Okay, thanks. Any other thoughts on the relationship between social class, race, and crime?
I might kind of pick up on what the deputy chief was saying here, which is when we talk about data that we have, the data that the feds collect is national level data. I mean, we do have some from the UCR, the police, but that's not kind of getting at some of the topics that you're talking about, and certainly the concepts that you're talking about, which are really important, especially policy and, you know, whether it's police policy or social services policy and that sort of thing. But that's drilling down to the subnational neighborhood level. And we just don't have that kind of data. And also the idea that we've kind of since the crime report and now, and then one of the things that's been very frustrating to me anyway, in some of the national rhetoric, is this kind of euphemism of inner city, which is speaking towards, I think certainly African Americans, and a certain stereotype of perception of how people live. And that's not to say that there aren't neighborhoods and cities that aren't like that, but if you look at the patterns of poverty, if you look at the patterns of where people live, it's really, now we're talking about suburbs, that where the largest percentage of growth of poverty has really come into the suburbs. And so the idea of, is there safety there? So kind of being able to drill down to the subnational level, neighborhoods, urban areas, suburban areas, to get a better handle at some of those issues of safety that would also would tie to kind of policy implications.
Do you get a sense of what has driven that? Is it a consequence of gentrification, people wanting to move back in cities and displacing poor families, or is it
It's both. So as the cities got safer, right? So it's the story. The city's getting safer, and then also kind of and then some of the gentrification, so it's many things going on.
Right.
So that the places that used to be where immigrants, impoverished individuals and would live, and also the deindustrialization of the cities. So now all of that's left. So you do have these areas that now are where you buy, like a $1 million condo in DC. I mean, that's not affordable housing. Certainly not to me. I don't know. But that's part. So where the affordable housing now is in the suburbs, and also ties into the policies of getting rid of certain discrimination in housing laws that allowed for a lot of families, to move to the suburbs, to high quality housing in the suburbs. So there was a lot of different things that went on with that.
John?
I want to mention two pieces of good news because I have a feeling most of this afternoon will be dreary. Cocaine consumption in the United States fell by 50% abruptly between 2006 and 2010. As a result, many, many thousands of people are not dead. So that's a big piece of good news, except it wasn't news. It was all but not reported because the media don't sell as many copies on good news. But yep, there's been some good. Another good thing is that 15 or 20 years ago, an awful lot of the hard drugs were sold in place-based markets between strangers. That can generate a lot of violence. Much of that retailing has moved to social network-based sales. Same amount of drugs being sold, fewer conflicts. That's progress. Let me try briefly to speak directly to the social class issue for the drug for which we have the best data and the one where you think perhaps it's not prominent, and that is marijuana. What proportion of all marijuana consumed in the United States do you think is consumed by college graduates who have no substance use disorder? If you're doing market segmentation analysis for the cannabis industry, and you're trying to educate them about their customer base, who they're going to make money from, what proportion of the market do you think is college grads who don't have any substance use disorder? 7. 60% would be the correct answer to my second question. What percentage of the marijuana is consumed by people with a high school degree or less? Everybody uses drugs, meaning have you used at all in the last year? But heavy users absolutely dominate the consumption. 80% of the marijuana is consumed by people who use marijuana daily or near daily. That heavy use is downscale.
And Phil, let me just ask you to comment on this statement before we change subjects. And how much of the gun violence that we've seen over the last 50 years has really been focused on the poorest citizens?
It's extraordinarily concentrated. If by gun violence we're talking about assaultive violence rather than suicide.
Right.
I mean, suicide has a somewhat different profile associated with it. But for assaults and homicides, I'm sure if you've been in Chicago, maybe you visited Hyde Park and the University of Chicago, they have a homicide rate in Hyde Park that is vanishingly small. And then are next door to neighborhoods that have rates that are 10 times the national average, 20 times the national average. And this is just a small geographic move along the way. And it has to do with who's living there and what resources they can muster. The theme for me resonates very much with something I'm passionate about, which is violence and violence victimization is one of the great sources of social inequality that we have. It is reflected, for example, in a study that was done years ago called Moving to Opportunity, where in 5 cities, mothers were recruited for an experimental relocation from housing projects, all from high poverty areas, housing projects, and they were asked, well, why are you interested in signing up for this experiment, expecting they'd hear about improving education opportunities or jobs or other kinds of amenities. But overwhelmingly, the answer was, I want to get away from the violence. I want to get away from the crime. I want to get away from places where my son is going to be recruited by a gang. And that crime then was the #1 issue, and it wasn't even close in terms of it. So those of us who are kind of feature ourselves as progressives and stuff have to see crime as one of the great sources of inequality, and reducing crime as one of the most progressive goals that we can have. So the fact that we have in fact had an extraordinary reduction in crime since the early 90s, and particularly violence, has been disproportionately benefit to poor neighborhoods and to minorities. So there's a lot more to be said about that, but that is.
Thank you. I want to pick up on a theme that several of you have mentioned, both in your presentations and then also in John's remarks just now about drugs markets. And that is technology has changed the ways in which drugs are distributed, as we've just heard. They've changed the ways in which police can do their jobs, as Daryl suggested earlier on. They've changed all kinds of things, and the potential for using drones to be involved in policing and in the distribution of drugs raise all kinds of possibilities of what the future is going to look like. And I wonder if you think technology on net has been good or bad for making America safer. Anyone can start. Bueller?
Well, I come from Carnegie Mellon, so technology makes us better. I actually have no idea what I think about the question you asked, whether it's on net helped or hurt. I do think that if you go out 25 years, not 5 years, there will be aspects of the information revolution that are dramatically changing aspects of crime. We at Carnegie Mellon believe there's no particular reason for human beings to drive cars. When cars are driven by robots, they have way more cameras than a cell phone. I mean, at some level, it'll be really hard to pull off a street crime in 25 years because there are going to be 100 cameras watching every single foot of sidewalk. Now, I don't want to make specific predictions because, again, specific predictions make you look like a fool. But the general idea that when this group gathers in 25 years, some gadget or gizmo has made a big difference in the crime, I bet on that.
Yeah, I mean, it's a big topic, and I think that to try to even begin to understand why crime rates have fallen as much as they have, when I talked about homicide falling in half, but since 1980, the property crime rate, according to the NCVS, has gone down 80%. You know, burglary is disappearing. You know, auto theft is way down. It is, and I wouldn't know about shoplifting, but have to believe that it's way down also. And to try to understand what's going on with property crime without looking at some of the technological advances that have been made that I think favor defense over offense in that area would, I think, be silly. So, I mean, the obvious one is LoJack, where we have very good evidence that LoJack has made a big difference for auto theft, and I'm sure it also has for computers and other things and other tracking devices. Just the fact that it's so simple to lock your car and lock your house now with the push of a button on something you carry in your pocket is really changed the defense and the shoplifting production we have. The more fundamental issue that cash is vanishing, right? I mean, cash used to be why people got robbed and often why they got burglarized, but cash is, where is it? You know, we don't carry nearly as much as we used to, and there have been very good protections for credit cards introduced privately in this area. So I would say just in this simple kind of situational crime prevention sense that the technology has really favored prevention for ordinary crime, for ordinary property crime. And for violent crime, it's been more about surveillance and issues along those lines and great improvements in surveillance. So that doesn't mean that we're done with this issue and there remain a lot of interesting issues like smart guns on the gun front. What can be the hope for that? I'm very optimistic that they would help. I think that if you look at the changes in policing, you have to look partly to data systems and CompStat and what the district attorneys are increasingly using management systems for identifying the high priorities defendants and so on and so on. I mean, there's a lot going on out there, which by and large, I think there's a clear answer to your question, and that is that it has led to crime reductions.
Thank you. Lyndon?
I might say that, kind of picking up on Phil's point there, is that we might not really know. It's because when we talk about property crime going down, that's the street crime. I mean, that's, traditional burglary, theft and that sort of thing. When we talk about theft, what a lot of us think now about theft is ID theft, or we think about cyber crimes. And those aren't necessarily captured as well in our data systems. So, it's only recently that I think ID theft was added to the NIBRS as one of the crimes. And when we don't have all states and all jurisdictions reporting in the NIBRS format, we really don't have that data. So in some ways, with regard to technology as a form of victimization or that sort of thing, I don't think we really know that information. But with regards, but we might have, I think, probably Gerald can speak more about the policing and technology as with regard to that aspect of it, which I would think has made us safer. I know you can speak. You're the expert on that.
Yeah, it's made us safer because of CompStat. I'm not sure if you guys know what CompStat is. You guys know what CompStat is, right? So so district commanders, police chiefs are able to look at this board, and there's a session once a week where you're able to come in and you're able to look at the dots on the map. And based on the crime and based on the technology that we now have, you can go back to your respective police departments or your respective shifts or your stations, and you can deploy accordingly. So with that regard, it does help. However, and I don't mean to be, and I'm 99% of the time an optimistic person, but I do, and I do say that we are more educated and we are more informed about issues that go on in our community, and as a result of that, we do a better job safeguarding ourselves. However, there are those out there, there's criminals out there who like to exploit the everyday person. And I think with the advent of technology and social media, I just think that the criminal he's waiting, he's lurking, he's gonna be invisible, you're never gonna see him, and that he's gonna just victimize us in ways that we don't know. Just take a look at maybe 11, 12 years ago. What was the biggest online crime 12 years ago? What was it, the Nigerian 419 letter? How many here received that letter or received that call, whatever the case? I mean, I did. So look at now. I mean, what is it gonna morph to now? I mean, I'm hearing cases of these hackers who are really sophisticated. And what is that thing now? The wiki thing that's going on now, the WikiLeaks and all that stuff. Look what's going to happen 10, 15 years from now.
Right.
There's going to be some hacker that's going to be able to hack each and every one of our computers. They're going to put some type of keystroke logger in there that's going to activate something hidden that you'll never know. And that suspect, that invisible suspect, can take, and just imagine that suspect that takes 99 cents from each of our bank accounts. And we all look at our bank accounts regularly, 2 or 3 times a day. And I look at mine just about every hour. But just think about it. Do you know if your bank account is going to miss 99 cents? Well, suppose that same person did that to 200,000 people. So I think in short, I think that the criminal eventually, with technology, he's going to be more craftier. And I think that policing and us, policy writers, I think that we need to be just as craftier to get on top of it.
I'd be interested to hear your perspective on body cameras for police officers and how that might change regular interactions, but also how does it, when you talked earlier about being called out on a call and there's a man who's having a bipolar episode and you're having to deal with that, how would that change a police officer's interaction with an uncertain situation like that? Was it going to potentially help?
Yeah, 100%. I love body cams. I wish we had it longer. I I wish we had it 10, 15, 20 years ago. We need it. There's certain situations where you obviously have to turn it off to protect the privacy, but in whole for policing, if you go out there and you're doing your job the proper way, no one should worry about who's watching you or if you have a video camera on. Just do your job the proper way, and there's no issues. So yeah, the body cams are going to help us. There's a lot of officers out there now that are very, very reluctant. In Baltimore, we started the body cams in May of this year. So we currently have about 600 body cams out there. We have about another 900 to go. But the officers are split half and half. Some of them love it, and some of them don't. The ones that love it are, guess what? The ones that don't mind doing their jobs. The ones that are having issues are the ones that you got to kind of like scratch your head and say, wait a minute. So it's great. It's going to be great for the issues that we're seeing with mental illness, that everyone, the community, and that educators and that mental health institutions can see the challenges that we face as first responders going to calls like this, and we can turn around and take the body cam video and use it as an educational tool to better policing.
Okay, thanks. I want to be mindful of the time to give the audience a chance to ask questions, but I do have one. I'm going to put you on the spot and ask you to do what John says is a terrible idea, to forecast. If in 50 years from today, 66, they decide to look back on forecasts made today, what is it about the future you think that will seem weird or naive? And what will they be dealing with 50 years from now that we aren't facing today? You know, Phil's already suggested one data point maybe is starting a new trend. So that's not that kind of, Phil is typically not much more reluctant to make forecasts. Phil, where are we going to go from here on gun violence?
Oh, and gun violence, okay.
Or anywhere. You can make all your forecasts you like.
On gun violence, I keep waiting for there to be a kind of a revolution in small arms technology, you know, so that the guns would be able to hit their targets in a much higher percentage of the case, or the Carnegie Mellon drones would start carrying guns and be directed so you can shoot. And so there are a lot of scary possibilities down the road, and I have no idea how that's going to play out. I would, just to be wild about it, I'm curious about, for example, changes in the technology of surveillance and our ability to keep track of people, which is, of course, keeps expanding rapidly, and wonder if that's going to ultimately greatly reduce the need for prison. You know, that we might see this increasingly as, you know, the glorified version of the bracelet, the electronic bracelet, might increasingly be seen as a way. If we can keep close tabs on somebody, maybe we don't need to spend $30,000 or $40,000 a year locking them up, depending on where they are. On a less sanguine note, I think, you know, just because of environmental change, we're going to be increasingly dealing with masses of displaced people, and that's going to be in the next, if you really want to talk about 50 years, you're talking about the coastlines gone under some scenarios, and you know, half the U.S. population, but also the world's population. And I think that may lead to a new sort of problem that we have to deal with, although it'll come gradually, and I have no idea what form it's going to take in the specifics, but it seems like a big thing hanging out there. And what we've seen in this election cycle, I think, is suggestive of increasing militant resistance to government and rejection of government that might mean that increasingly you have the militias and the white racist groups and others who are going to take matters into their own hand and start shooting sheriffs and generally causing problems. So that actually does not seem like a 50-year problem so much as a 5-year problem. So anyway, there's some ideas.
Thanks. Anyone else want to step out onto the edge there?
I predict, or at least I hope, that 50 years from now we'll talk a lot more about environmental crime, banking and securities crime, crime against businesses, particularly foreign actors stealing intellectual property, crime against government. More money is stolen from Medicare than is stolen from all household burglaries combined, just that one insurance program. Military contractor fraud, there are many kinds of crimes that did not seem important when we set up the UCR in 1930 that I think truly are important but get overlooked because we don't have data systems for them.
Harold?
And just in short, I just think that cybercrimes, we're going to hit a level with cybercrimes that we're going to just, it's going to catch us off guard.
Okay.
And I hate to say that in a negative way, but I just think that we have to prepare for that. I think the good thing is that, having said that, is that the officers 50 years are going to be so well equipped that you're not going to have to go to a roll call, that you're going to be able to pick up your smartphone and you're going to be able to handle just about any situation possible, the mental health, whatever the case is, with the touch of the screen.
Right, thanks. Lynn, you want to add anything?
And I don't know, because I was thinking about the way the commission portrayed America 50 years ago, and I thought, who would think that this is going on, which
Right.
is there are riots and discontent in cities. There's people believing that crime is worse than it is, and you have a conservative political group asking for law and order. I mean, it's not anything what we would
Right.
believe in,
Right.
which we have all of those
All
things
right.
now, right?
Yeah.
And so I think 50 years from now, we'll probably still have people thinking there's too much crime, that, more than crime, people
Yeah.
calling for law and order, and people also probably discontent being exhibited. Hopefully not violently, but certainly people are driven to express themselves that way for various reasons. So I think everything old is new again. So
Right.
I don't know if there's going to be a lot of
That's what
changes.
my read of the report reminded me of, that the more things change, the more they stay the same. But a number of you raised great points about the way the technology certainly has opened up doors to new types of crime. And Phil and John's point about how the environment is changing, shaping up to cause real harm and concern in the future. I'm going to push back a little bit on Phil on the point that we've got some possibility for hostile anti-government groups to be real problems. Those kinds of groups have been a problem in the United States throughout our history. So I certainly hope that we're not anywhere different on that front. I hope I'm right and Phil's wrong, but we'll see in a few years maybe. But let's open the.
I hope so, too.
Let's open the floor to questions. We have folks with microphones here. Erdal?
Thank you very much. And I want to ask you about stop and frisk. So it's police practice that captured a lot of attention in this election cycle. A judge ruled that it was carried out in a manner that violated the Constitution, although the practice itself is not necessarily unconstitutional. And I would like to hear from a practitioner what your thoughts on can it be carried out in a way that doesn't violate the Constitution?
Yeah, stop and frisk was awful. Growing up in New York City, it was very prevalent back then. Growing up in a tough community myself in Queens, New York, I saw it then. I saw it before I came on the police department. I saw it now. It really increased around the time where we had something called zero tolerance, and I think zero tolerance really disproportionately affected African American young men in the community. And as a result of that, stop and frisk went up. Yeah, police tried to safeguard community, but when I went back, if you go back to that slide, the education piece, the training piece, that had a lot to do with it. We weren't properly trained in the tactics then, and it really hurt us now. So yeah, stop and frisk really put us in a bad position.
Okay, thanks. Other questions? Back?
Phil Cook. We hear a lot about the NRA's suppression of data on guns. How has that manifest as something that has retarded our ability to have informed evidence-based policy with regard to guns? If you were a benevolent dictator, what data would we have that we don't now have?
Yeah, I mean, you could have a wish list that goes as far as you're willing to dream on that issue, but at the most fundamental level, the NRA has been effective in limiting the creation of certain kinds of data, including some kind of registration system on guns so we would know who had bought guns or where particular guns were first sold even, without going through a very elaborate process in tracing that is required right now. That's all because of this resistance to the idea of the government is going to take our guns away from us, and we want to make that as difficult as possible. But I think that in states that have that, like California most notably, it has not been abused, and it is useful in police investigations and makes a big difference. So that's data that for the most part doesn't exist, this kind of simple link between a gun and a seller that we could get. The stuff that is getting attention is data that does exist, and that is when police departments trace the guns that they recover through the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, National Tracing Center. Then the data that they receive back from ATF is typically not made public, but kept within the confines of the police department. And so that there is a possibility there of a national research program. Instead, what we have is occasional research programs where a scholar has a connection with a particular police department and is able to then work out an agreement to look at just their trace data is what it amounts to. And you guys work with Daniel Webster a lot, there's a lot of this. So then on the, it's interesting, there's a lot more to be said about data. The other thing that the pro-gun forces have done is try to stop research on the data that are available by cutting funding from the CDC. And so for a while, we had actually a fairly robust public health research program against gun violence. And to a large extent, that has been stopped because of the success that the NRA had with Congress in simply cutting out that funding stream along the way. So here again, we have one of the leading cause of death for large groups of the population, the leading cause of health disparities between blacks and whites at below age 35. And the CDC is not able to sponsor research in the area. It's simply not able to happen. So it's this absolutely crazy situation. When they were funding that, they produced findings that were of great concern to the pro-gun faction. Really, the ones that were most concerned was demonstrating that it's risky to have a gun in the house. And that was an unacceptable finding, which they wanted repressed. No, I mean, they do some these days. The Joyce Foundation was in Chicago, was the pioneer in this area, and they have now gotten help from the Bloomberg Foundation and some of the other foundations that were created from privatization and Blue Cross, Blue Shield, and here and there are sources, Harry Frank Guggenheim, but it can never compete with the deep pocket, which is the federal government.
Sam, do you have a question?
I guess I have a policing question, but I promise it's not about Freddie Gray. It's actually about community policing. Okay, I guess it ties in a little. But what kind of community policing strategies has Baltimore been using? And what's the community reception given the current views on police and possible distrust? Like, is it hard to bridge the gap, or are there ways to do that?
That's a great question, and I think every single chief gets that now, and I'm really proud to say that in Baltimore, I think that that gap that was out here is here, and I think the biggest problem that we face in this profession years past, even before Freddie Gray, even before the incident in St. Louis, I think that community and police, we had our issues, and I think that no one wanted to come to the median, and I think that we all did one thing, to try and blame each other. Everyone did this. And I think now that we're getting here, and I just want to talk about one program that's been really, really successful in Baltimore. Actually, I want to talk about two programs, and I'll say it really, really quick. So the Outward Bound program in Baltimore has been dynamite. So we started the Outward Bound program last year, where we picked 23 officers every single Thursday, and we team them up with 23 middle or high school kids. And they come together and they participate in field activities from 8 o'clock to 2 o'clock in the afternoon. And what's interesting about this Outward Bound program is that we're deliberately picking kids from challenging communities, and then we bring them and link them up with the police officers in the morning. It's like this: the police on this side, the kids on this side. So by the time lunchtime comes around, and they're talking about real life issues, by the time lunchtime comes around, that group is like this. By the time the end of the day comes around, the group is like this. And the best thing about it is that there have been so many relationships forged that even beyond the program, now the kids are friends. They're friends with the officers that they see in the community every day. So we're really bridging the gap. The other one that I want to talk about is a new program that we just started a couple of weeks ago, and it's called Transformation Inside Out. And the Transformation Inside Out is a pilot program that we started with the ICP, Howard University, and the Baltimore Police Department. So the Baltimore police officers go to Howard University every single Tuesday, and they link up with college kids. And it's really tough, courageous conversation that they go. It's a regular, how long is the length of a semester? 13, 14, 15 weeks. So they're going through that right now. And you would think that it was real easy, and you would think just on paper it sounds great, but no. The first day, the first Tuesday, I think the day before, there was the incident that took place in, I think it was I'm forgetting the city where the young lady officer had the encounter. It was at Tulsa, Tulsa, Oklahoma. So that class was heated. So as early as directly after that, it's like this now. We took a step backwards yesterday. I wish I can tell you afterwards what happened, but this Transformation Inside Out program is the first of its kind, and that we hope to model this policy or this program in all the cities, but we want to start in the state of Maryland first. But those are two programs that are real dynamite. We're really bridging the gap. And if you think about community policing, the police should not be doing the crime solving on their own. You have to link community with that. So together you guys formulate a crime plan, that you guys figure out the conditions that surround the crime, and you collectively together work on those issues so the crime eventually goes away. So you can't just talk about locking him up. What creates the conditions? And police and community need to work on those together. And that's exactly the focus that we're taking in Baltimore.
Other questions?
Hello, I have a question for Professor Addington. So obviously, data has improved a lot since the inception of the UCR back last century. So I was wondering, you talked about how data is going to continue to improve over the coming decades. What kind of conclusions do you think we'll be able to draw from this new data? You must have some kind of idea. What do you think we will see with this new data, and what kind of changes will come from it?
I always have to laugh when people say last century because it makes me feel really old. I know that's the new term and everything. But I think ideally we will have data that is flexible enough to kind of keep current with, so the idea is you always want to have indicators that maintain a trend. So we know certain things and whether homicides will probably always be of interest to people, right? But then there are other emerging crimes that some of them we know about and others we don't. And so do we have a system that's flexible enough to allow us to tap into some of those things? One of the issues right now with both the police-involved shootings and also use of force is we don't necessarily have really good data to track that, and that'd be good for both sides. So we know how much, we've got thousands and thousands of police officers, and these are very isolated, thank goodness, incidents. But we don't have a lot of information. And also, it'd be great to know mental health issues and all these other things to put context on some of that. So I think that's ideally where we would be going with some of these data sources. And again, that's something where when I was mentioning the issue about an omnibus, like crime collection system, in some ways it's very useful to get a lot of information about, you're very broad but not necessarily very, very deep. And so it might be there's certain areas that we want to kind of get a deep dive into things to get a better understanding. Right now, one of the areas where there's a lot of work being done in that is with the issues that are traditionally couched in violence against women. So rape, sexual assault, certainly not everyone who's a victim of rape, sexual assault is female, nor intimate partner violence. But that's kind of that's been the momentum pushing some of this, where we get instruments, survey instruments that they call them behavior specific, and ask very specific questions about sexual violence as well as partner violence, about all sorts of things. Did they do this, that, and the other thing? Those are very helpful for certain segments of the population, but when you're looking at trying to get data on younger people, like 12, 10-year-olds, I mean, those are questions that are difficult to ask, difficult to get past parents to ask about some of these things, even though those issues happen. So I think that's where the idea of having flexibility to get at, and so that data stays current with the issues that we want information about, whether it's cyber crimes or issues of some of the hate crime issues. That stuff, that those are issues that have developed over time to keep up with what society's interested in.
I like that question. It's clearly a student thinking about future research questions. Brad?
One more policing question for Deputy Chief D'Souza. I was wondering if you could just comment a little bit more on your feelings of the nature of police innovation moving forward. You mentioned a couple of times in your presentation that, a lot of the problems that we saw in the 60s that gave rise to significant innovations like, say, community-oriented policing, which I would argue is more of a paradigm shift and a major change, or at least the way it was supposed to be done, a major change, are still with us today. Whether it's social, political unrest, right, or what have you, possibly increasing crime rates, at least within the last year or two. I guess my question is, given that we still see some of the same problems today, do you see the next round of policing innovations coming in the form of a major paradigm shift, or do you see it as more of an iterative process that focuses on small technological changes or medium technological changes like body cameras and the like?
I think more of the medium, I think to more progressive. I think that what I would like to see, and I think the direction we're going, and some cities are doing it now, like Philadelphia, for example, is like real-time crime tracking. So we have CompStat, it's once a week. Cities have CompStat, it's once a week. But guess what we're talking about? We're talking about the crime that happened 7 days ago, or 14 days ago, or 28 days ago. So why aren't we talking about crime that happened in real time? So I think that that piece with technology, I think we'll be on a precipice if we get information on and it sounds crazy, but if you work the day work shift and I work the Charlie shift, I'm coming on, I know immediately what happened. I know what happened, or what happened 10 minutes ago in another part of the city. So I see that shift that we're going to. I wish it was quicker, but I think it's still going to take a couple of years before we get there.
We have time for one more question.
In terms of recruitment, policeman the staff is only as good as the leadership and the officers. So my question is twofold. Number one, what are you looking for when you look for a recruit? And number two, are veterans giving preference, and do you think that skill set sits well in transferring to become a police officer?
So I think that what we're looking for, and this is the way it should be, I think that policing should reflect community. So I think that's the way we need to go. It's very difficult now with the recent incidents that are occurring in major cities that recruiting is down. Is no surprise. Recruiting typically is unfortunately down in the minority community. So policing now is about 13% minority. Some cities are great. Baltimore is 18%, but we want to see police officers who are just, and we have millennial officers out there now, we just want to see police officers someone that is open-minded, someone that's willing to engage, someone that's not afraid, someone that's not afraid to take a chance. Just education doesn't have to be a big component, but someone that has an understanding of community and has an understanding of the word empathy. So I think that's the key phrase, is that if you're empathetic, I think that you can be a police officer. I think you can work in any profession. I think that's part one to your question. And the second part, in terms of senior officers?
No, military.
Military, yeah. We
think that discipline transfers well?
absolutely.
You do?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
My experience has been some military people think that there's a a way to do things, and there's a way to do things. And when you're an officer in certain communities, it's a different discipline in terms of you often have to expect people are going to get into your face, and you have to be calm in those type of circumstances. And certain officers with military backgrounds are less tolerant in dealing with that. Has that been your experience? or
No,
you
I
can't-
haven't. I haven't. In my experience, all the great officers, and I'm sorry I never was in the military, but the better officers that I've worked with and trained are, have prior military background.
Right. Well, so I want to close by just making a remark, but that if you look back at the crime report in 1967, there was already discussion about use of data. There was already discussion about using computers to model how resources were allocated. But that was a time when, as Lynn pointed out, the data were sparse and of poor quality. What computers could do then are a micro fraction of what they're capable of doing today. So I think that we can take some comfort in the fact that what we've heard today about the policy knowledge we've developed over the last 50 years and understanding what shapes crime trends, what shapes behavior, is really heartening for thinking about in the future if the technological changes we've just heard about improve the kind of data we can get, improve the kind of ways we can see interactions between people people who are civilians and police officers, between people amongst themselves and in the community. Hopefully, the next crime report includes, or the next time a group like this meets, we'll have a lot better data and even lower crime. So I want to thank very much each of our panelists. It's been a great discussion, and then invite you all to come out and join the reception and talk to the panelists yourselves. Thanks.